Hello, hockey fans, and welcome back in to another episode of Hockey 101. We have, I think, over the course of this series, explored a lot of topics that you might say are past 101 a little bit. We've cycled back, we've cycled forth, but our goal has always been the same: to educate you and educate ourselves along with it about what the heck is going on with college hockey, with the CHL, and what it could mean, most importantly, for you and your player. And in a discussion as wide ranging as this, in a subject matter that is so complex, so nuanced, I wouldn't even dare wade into the waters of NCAA eligibility. I wouldn't even wander a foot off the path of, will Canada become the new exporter of NHL talent? I wouldn't dream of shooting myself in a rocket aimed at anything other than the truth. Without one man, it's Dan K. Dan, welcome to Hockey 101.
Lucas, before we get into real talk of NCAA eligibility, I've been mulling over my own of late with some new NCAA rulings, Lucas. I with 2 years of JUCO under my belt, have gotten those 2 years of eligibility back. I could potentially be on a ball diamond somewhere if I can just get myself into shape. But we've got some bigger things to talk about than that. And the big storylines right now are a lot of what our viewer feedback has been over the last few weeks, talking about clamoring for these numbers, these details, these spreadsheets, these deep dives into the data, into the analytics that tell the story that is the current framework of developmental hockey, junior hockey, and collegiate hockey, all the way up, and how it translates into professional hockey. What we are going to talk about today on today's show are those numbers of what things look like at the NHL level right now in terms of participation and where those participants came from in their hockey development journey. We're also going to take a look at those numbers and start to make some conjectures, some predictions, some prognostications as to what the future of the game may look like. And we cannot make projections and predictions and prognostications without the man who dives into these numbers for us and doesn't just dive in. I could look at numbers, I could throw spreadsheets at you, but I don't have the experience, the understanding, the detailed knowledge of this game from every single facet, from lacing up the skates for the first time to skating out onto an NHL rink somewhere in this country, that our host with the most, Bob Turo, has. Bob, we're talking some big things tonight. You've got some big numbers to share with the viewers. A lot of graphics coming at you from the great Lucas Jones on the editing machine. Talk about what we have in store for the folks today on Hockey 101.
Let's start, guys, with where the numbers are right now as far as who's supplying players to the National Hockey League. 47% from the CHL, 29% from the NCAA, 24% from all the European leagues. That's where it's at now before the big change where CHL players are able now to play in the NCAA. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the 2004 NHL draft. There was 225 players that were drafted. Eventually, we're going to look at the 2025 draft when it happens in June. But right now, we're going to look at the top 105 North American skaters. So eventually, it'll be 450. Okay. Will there be players that aren't drafted that make the NHL? Lucas, we've already looked at that. Of course there are. But the truth of the matter is, if you're not winning the draft game, you're not winning. You're getting the scraps if you're relying on undrafted players. So we're going to dig in today into the 225 from last year's NHL draft, the 105, which is the top 105 skaters, North American, and the top 5 North American goalies. And Dan, to your point, we're going to jump forward and we're going to start making a look at predictions. And we know from the 2024 NHL draft, as you can see on the spreadsheet, that there are 35 players, got my cursor over it right now, that have already signed ELCs, entry-level contracts. That means they are ineligible to play NCAA, and whether they play in the NHL or the AHL or wherever they're going to play, they're going to advance to pro hockey, and the CHL is going to get credit for their development. There are also 31 Europeans. We're not focusing on the Europeans today, especially for the 25 draft, but you can't ignore them. They're 24% of the league. And right now, 31 out of the 225 from last year's NHL draft have already signed ELCs. There are 2 players from NCAA, Celebrini being one of them, that has signed an ELC. So the score right now, if I'm just looking at CHL versus NCAA, is 35-2. And what I mean by score is there's no going back for these kids who are from the CHL. They are CHL property that have been advanced to pro hockey.
I think it's pretty dramatic. It's a pretty dramatic. You call it a score, and if that were a score of a hockey game, you might have some questions.
It's a massive head start, guys. If you take a look in the old way of doing it, a lot of agents would push their kids to play in the CHL because they would sign contracts right away before NCAA guys would, and the agents would get paid. It'll be interesting to see how the agents work all this out, because they're going to be possibly negotiating bigger nil deals that the agents could make more money on. So I don't want to get too far ahead of us, because March 23rd is when it all starts to happen with the CHL ending, and we're going to see if the NCAA is going to recruit some of these big-time players away. But a whole bunch of them are ineligible right now. The next thing that we have to look at is not all draft picks are equal, guys. Lucas, can we put up the chart, how many first-rounders make it, second, third, fourth, fifth? What do you see, Dan?
I see that the first round's pretty important, Bob, and it's a major drop off. We're talking about dropping from the Rocky Mountains down to the pastures out there in Nebraska in terms of first to second round probability of making things happen at the NHL level.
And it's not like kids in the 7th round aren't going to make it. Sure they are. Nikita Kucherov, I think, was a 3rd round pick. I mean, he's one of the best players in the league. I mean, but if you're not playing in the 1st round from a recruiting standpoint versus your competition, if you're the CHL versus the NCAA or the NCAA versus the CHL, you're out of luck. And when you take a look at the spreadsheet now, back to the ELCs, in the top 2 rounds of the 24 draft, right now the score is 22-2.
I mean, it's interesting to see the data laid out. And I think the reason it's always interesting to see data like this, some people who are watching this might go, yeah, guys, duh, the first round's pretty important, right? But seeing the data validates the opinion. The data validates the feeling. It's fine to have opinions. It's fine to think that the first round is important. But to see 74% against 34%, to see numbers like 22-2, to see the overall numbers be so different, it should be shocking. It should validate those opinions. But I think the thing that's more interesting to me is the tail off, that a lot of people will say, oh, you get drafted, you're drafted. But it looks like after the first round, there's a huge drop off. And then even after the second round, there's a drop off. From the 3rd to 7th round, you're not seeing much of a change. So it's not quite first round or bust. But as Dan said, the first round is pretty important. The data backs that up, and not in a way where it can be minced. It is fairly irrefutable.
Well, if you're in the NCAA, I'll really scare you right now. Because if you take a look at the North American top 100 skaters, add in the top North American 5 goaltenders, for 105 of North America's best skaters. I'm not saying there aren't Europeans that are going to come over or going to make the NHL. Of course there are. And I'm not, by the way, there are Europeans in this 105. Okay. A North American skater, just by definition, by NHL Central Scouting, is anybody who's playing in North America in any of the leagues. But if you take a look at the top 105, right now in the CHL, they have 71 in the top 105, and Division One has 34. Again, not all draft choices are equal. If you take a look at the top 32, which will eventually be players that are drafted in the first and second round, because we'll eventually have to mix Europeans in with this group for the real draft. But if you just take the top 32 teams in the NHL and the top 32 skaters in North America for this year's draft, it's CHL 26 and NCAA 6.
Yeah, and one of the things I do want to point out too, a similar sport to these numbers we're talking about, this drop off between round one and round two in terms of roster size at the professional ranks, the MLB. You look at those numbers, round one, about 71.5% of first round draft picks are in the MLB actively playing. Then it drops to 53% in the second round, 44% in the third round. It doesn't get to 34, that first round and the second round drop, until the fourth round of the MLB draft. That's a similar roster size, 25 players on an MLB roster, 26 now when they expand them. It's interesting to see just how important top round draft picks are to these hockey players, to this battle between the NCAA and the CHL.
So we're going to put this up on the Dan K website, Hockey 101, and there's three major components, and we'll gussy this up a little bit for everybody. But the first part is the ELC development scorecard. And these are the kids that are highlighted in black here with the white print. And you can see here which side gets credit for it. You can see Celebrini's green. And you can see here Seneke from Oshawa has signed an ELC. So he's CHL. You can see everybody. And then as you scroll down, you can see the Euros over here. Every time that somebody signs an ELC, we're going to keep track of this. And we're going to take them from the second group, which is right here. This is the remainder of the 2024 draft. And when Caden Lindstrom here, who plays in Medicine Hat, if he signs an ELC, we'll highlight him in black and we'll push him up to the top and we'll credit whoever gets him. Now you can see here as we scroll through this, there's a bunch of NCAA players. I have them colored in the darker green than the CHL players, which are in the lighter green. And the reason why there's more, and these are all first round draft picks, guys. But don't be fooled. Go back up to the top here. The score is not very good for the NCAA. These kids here, I doubt that as 2005s or 2006s, they're going to go play in the CHL. So they're going to probably go on to pro hockey out of Division One. And say Trevor Connolly from Providence here, say he signs an ELC at the end of this NCAA season. We'll highlight him. We'll put him up there. We'll keep a running total. What's going to be really interesting, guys, is these kids from the CHL, Lindstrom, Alec, Eliasson, Mia Tinton. Did I say that right? Mia Tinton.
I'd imagine it's Maya Tynan.
Maya Tynan.
Maya Tynan, thank you. Thank you. Richie, is Division One hockey going to get these kids to flip? Because if they don't get them to flip, at the numbers that we've looked at that they're behind right now, they're going to be really behind. And the numbers, as these players make their way from 17 and 18 up to 22 and 23 when they get into the National Hockey League, are going to affect the 47% that are CHLers versus 29%, which are NCAA players. And it's just going to separate unless Division One can start flipping these guys.
Well, I think it goes back to something that we've brought up in a couple of different contexts, that this is not 400 players or however many the number set we want to use. This is not X number of players independently making their own decisions based on what they think is best for them. They're not in a vacuum. They're not in an isolation chamber. They're watching these numbers come in. They're watching what's happening, who's going where, what sides are having more success, right? So when you talk about being able to flip guys, what you're talking about is saying, I'm better. But do the numbers back that up? Does the public perception back that up? That's why in the first couple of shows, we talked so heavily about the public perception, about needing to make statements, needing to make big swinging moves, because now you're at the point where the public perception is helping players to make decisions, and not just this year, but down the pipe. It doesn't take a long time to form an opinion. Opinions are formed very quickly, especially in a sport like hockey, where you have to make these decisions that theoretically impact your playing career in a huge way. So when you say the NCAA needs to get players to flip, and you look at some of the numbers we've talked about already, the prospect seems daunting.
So Lucas, we talked early on about the narrative. Division One was not controlling the narrative. The CHL was controlling the narrative. And at one point I said, listen, okay, so they're making a mistake here by not controlling the narrative, but maybe they'll control the narrative on March 23rd when the CHL season ends, and they can start signing these CHL players who are NHL picks and starting to get them. If they don't do that, and one other thing comes true that we've predicted here that's going to come true, that all of the best 16 and 17-year-olds who are 15 and 16 now are going to be racing to the CHL next year. Oh, and by the way, possibly 2 USHL teams are going to be racing to the CHL. It's over. If they're not leaving this year and the CHL is able to keep all the players this year, why wouldn't they be able to keep all the players the following year and the year after that and the year after that? And if the CHL can do that, then the other prediction that we made is going to come true, and that is the NCAA is going to end up being U Sport with no NHL players. There's just going to be a slow reduction in the number of NHL prospects playing Division I hockey. Here's some numbers for you. If you take a look, there's 171, from the 2004 draft, 171 that you would call kind of North American skaters. The NCAA right now is on a track to have 64 of those players. To get to a break even, number-wise, and this isn't including first-rounders and what we looked at there, they got to get to 86. They got to flip 22 CHLers. Oh, and by the way, they can't lose any of their players. I mean, that's nuts. If you take a look at the first 2 rounds of the 24 draft, there's 65 North American League players. We already know that 22 will advance from the CHL, and 9 CHL players are unsigned right now, but could sign out of the CHL. That's 31 total. We know that Celebrini and the kid from Michigan State give the NCAA 2. They have 15 on track that, if the NCAA can keep them, gives them 17. The score is 31-17. So to get to break even, the NCAA has to flip 7 of those CHL players. And we'll find out starting on March 23rd when the CHL ends, if some of those players are going to start signing commitments to go to college. It's scary. We looked at the numbers for the 105 for the 2005 NHL draft. 71 are on track to be coming out of the CHL. 34 are on track to play NCAA hockey. The NCAA's got to flip 19 CHL players. Like, that's a massive number, guys. Now, here's something that could happen. They get a couple big names like Schaefer and Misa, who are top 5 NHL picks. It could flip the narrative, and the guys who are going to be later first round picks, or maybe second, third, fourth round picks, maybe they start thinking about flipping as well. I don't know. We're going to find out. As we talked about earlier, March 23rd is when the CHL season ends. You're going to have basically 12 teams in the 3 CHL leagues that don't make the playoffs, and you can start signing those players right away. The NCAA can. 2 weeks later, you're going to have 24 more teams that are out. And why can they sign them? Again, if Michael Misa from Saginaw is going to leave and go to BU, like a bunch of places have reported, and I have no idea if that's true or not, there's no way he's telling Saginaw in the middle of his season, I'm going to BU at the end of this year.
Yep.
He's doing it at the end of the year. Listen, it's no different than we talk a lot of football and basketball here. You're an absolute star playing for, I don't know, Georgia. And your agent's working behind the scenes because you can get major league nil money at SMU. You're not announcing that until Georgia season's over. Oh, the Beck kid did that, didn't he? Only he's going to Miami for $4 million.
Yep, 100%.
So it could get wild here. Let's get back into the spreadsheet. Because when I say they got to flip these players, guys, there's more to it. So I'm going to scroll down here, and if you take a look at, this is now the 2004 draft. If you keep scrolling down, here we have Luke Osborne. He's committed to Wisconsin in 26-27. He's a deferred commitment. He's an NHL draft. Are you telling me this kid can't play Division I hockey as an NHL draft? He's a 4th rounder.
Yep.
Is this kid really going to play another year in the USHL? Oh, by the way, look at, he's playing in Youngstown. Maybe he'll be playing in the OHL next year anyways. I mean, come on. Let's scroll down a little bit further because there's another one. Here's a kid who's playing for Acadia Bathurst, who's committed to Maine in 26-27. What? He's going to stay in Acadia Bathurst? I mean, if he is, and he has a good year, you know where he's going the following year? He's going pro hockey, and Maine's never going to see him. Here's some really scary stuff. Let's get into the top 105, which are primarily 2007 birth years. These are the 25 NHL draft eligibles. They're mainly 07s. There's some late birth 06s. But the guys I want to focus in on, if I scroll down further, are these guys in red. Is William Moore going to wait a year? Like, he's played 2 years at the development program.
No.
Is he not going to the OHL next year, or whatever league controls his rights in the CHL? Or is Boston College going to step up and say, we need you next year or else we're never going to see you again? BU's got a commitment. Arizona State's got a commitment. Mass has got a commitment. Minnesota does. Like, look at all these kids. They could lose every one of those kids. And remember, if they all go to the CHL, and I don't know how many there are there, 9, 10, something like that are deferred. Well, there's more here. A lot more, 15. If 2 of them blossom in the CHL, the NCAA is not seeing them. They're going straight to pro hockey. And you know who Division One gets? The guys who aren't going to pro hockey, or the guys that are going to have to turn out and be late bloomers. Why are these colleges not stepping up and taking these kids right away?
Well, I think the biggest question for you, Bob, is how many sports does Canadian hockey have to focus on? They have to focus on one, hockey, right? They have to
Yeah.
focus on governing themselves. When you look at the NCAA, you're talking about the governance of multiple different sporting bodies in 3 different seasons throughout an entire year, with your main money makers being basketball and football, and hockey kind of straddling a timesheet in their schedule that is dominated by something that's leading into March. You talk about March 23rd, a lot of folks are thinking about March Madness, right? They're thinking about college basketball this time of year. They're thinking about the money that's going to be generated there, and they're fighting their own wars that we've talked about a little bit, and we'll talk about at some point when it comes to the world of private equity. And hockey is not a part of that conversation right now, and it should be, right? It certainly should be. And I think that there's folks like yourself that are passionate enough to see what hockey is fighting against in the US here, not just when it comes to losing to Canada in every big game ever and losing at the Four Nations, not just when it comes to losing in the development game and where the best players are going, but losing in the world of, I mean, having the best product. And right now, the CHL is ahead, and the CHL continues to be ahead because they're focused on hockey, and there is no one focused on NCAA Division One hockey as a whole, other than just the coaches themselves who are trying to recruit and trying to keep jobs.
There's a way that Division One hockey could get really into the fight for every kid that we looked on this spreadsheet. And we've talked about it.
Yep.
Just the only recruiting that you do, make the rule that you have to either recruit just true freshmen or true freshmen plus a year. And then all 60, whatever there's going to be after this year, odd NCAA teams will have to get in and fight. And rather than taking these age outs who are not going to ever play in the National Hockey League, but they're just going to allow their Division One team to be a little bit more competitive. And I get it. Coaches want to win games. But that's the way you fight the CHL. And until somebody grabs hold of the wheel and says, does developing National Hockey League players matter for Division One hockey? And if it does, what's our business model? And figures out we got to just have freshmen or true freshmen. Until that happens, you're just going to have your rich teams maybe buying your kids, and there's just not going to be enough of them.
Let me play a dumb devil's advocate here, or a fun one. Let's put it this way. You look at the world right now, how much does NCAA Division One ice hockey owe to USA hockey, right? And some of these organizations that in this brave new world we're in with CHL eligibility to go to NCAA Division One, they're hurting right now. They're hurting in the USHL, they're hurting in the NOL, and they're hurting at the teams below it in the EHL and others. And you look at it right now, if some of these top guys go to the CHL, if the NCAA is losing that battle, if they do not get first to the bowl rights, right? If they're not the first dog to eat, does that trickle down help USA hockey, help some of these teams that expect a loss in Division One commitments and bolster them a bit? Does it almost pay off in a way for some of the other dogs in this fight to see the NCAA lose this battle?
And what? Be able to say, are you saying that the North American League would be able to say, I've got more Division One commitments right now, but they're not going to the National Hockey League?
Correct.
Who cares?
It's,
Like at
it's
that, at
the
that
fight
point,
for aesthetics, right?
well, is it?
For
Like
them.
at what point in time? At what point in time, if there's no NHL hockey players, are schools just going to say, I'm not doing this anymore? I've got a basketball team that needs money. I got to build volleyball's big at my school.
Yeah.
I've got to do something there. I mean,
especially when a lot of these programs are not making money, right? The Minnesota
right.
hockey team makes money. They're one of the few, if any, who do. I do think that there is something to what Dan is saying about D1 players, because a realistic hockey player, and I think I've, I've I've only been in the space for a decade now. Bob, you have forgotten more about hockey than I will learn. But from what I've seen in the last 10 years, players, yes, are jumping around a lot more. Players are less loyal, but that's also a generational thing. Younger generations are less brand loyal as a whole. If younger generations, if we don't see a brand of a product that we like, we'll just get a different brand. We're not waiting for it to go back into stock, right? And I think that's transferring, or not transferring. I think that is exactly what's happening when coaches say, oh, players aren't loyal to the program anymore. They're always looking for something else. Yes, generationally, that's where they're going for. With that, though, comes a dose of realism. You don't switch brands of ketchup without first understanding that they're not really that different, right? You don't switch leagues without, or teams without acknowledging, there's not really a difference there. There's a slight advantage, a slight disadvantage, whatever. So I think that dose of realism might encourage some players who know they could play D1 hockey and know they're not making it to the NHL. That is a subsection of players that exists. They want the recognition of D1 hockey. They want to play. They want to be kings on campus. They want to go to school. Maybe they're getting some kind of finances out of it, right? Whether it's NIL, partial scholarships, whatever it is. They want D1, but they know they're not going to the show. That subsection exists. And from what
Yeah.
I see, I believe it's growing. And so I think, to Dan's point, that could certainly happen. There are people who play junior hockey who know they're not going to go play college hockey. There are people who play high school hockey knowing they're never going to get to juniors. So those people certainly exist, and they continue to bolster the ranks of where they are. And then they stop. So I do think, Dan, you have a really good point there. If people are willing to stop and understand that players are realistic, they're not as pie in the sky as some people make them out to be.
Guys, I think you see massive contraction
Yeah.
unless you see a lot of flipping from CHL to NCAA right away in March and April and into May. I mean, I think you're at a point where you're going to have a lot of programs say, I'm AIC. I'm done.
Well, and that's how it
And
works,
so that
right?
and so now the pot of those players, listen, I don't want to call them insignificant, but eventually you get to U Sport. They're all great kids. They all want to play hockey. They all were good hockey players at some point in time. The vast majority of those U Sport kids were CHL players. They're not going to the NHL. This will be something. Here's another point that's going to be very interesting and I've talked to coaches about this, these age outs that they're taking from the CHL. Typically, when they go to U Sport, the dream is over. Like when the dream is over, even though you're still a good kid and you're still a good hockey player, you don't have the same drive.
Yep.
Okay. It'll be interesting to see if these kids who would have went to U Sport and are now coming to Division One, if they have the drive in Division One, because it's like 3, 4, 5 coaches, I don't know, have said to me, I don't think they understand the expectation that we have here in our program.
Yep.
This isn't funsies hockey anymore. This isn't intramural. Okay. This isn't club team. Okay. This is Division One. You're going to be expected to lift. You're going to be expected to practice. You're going to be expected to watch what's going into your body from a nutritional standpoint. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how these kids work out, because if they don't work out, then there's even, and you want to have real hockey in Division One, then there's even more reason why you want to go down and get the 17 and 18-year-old kids, because those kids still have the dream.
Correct. Yep.
The game, listen, they've screwed up. Division I hockey is screwed up by not controlling the narrative. They can grab all that back starting March 23rd.
Yeah. And the biggest thing is this. I'm going to put a little bit of water on you here, sadly. And the idea is the NCAA is never going to make a mandate that you have to have X amount of 18-year-olds or you lose eligibility over time, because any NCAA mandate will have to mandate every sport. And they are not going to tell J.R. Smith that he can't leave the NBA and go golf down in North Carolina when he's 36 years old. They're not going to tell someone who just served in the military that they can't play football at Louisville at the age of 29, right? They're not going to take away those storylines for themselves because they're so few and far between. And the NCAA, the way that they have and always will operate, is that it is sweeping. It is widespread. It is every sport. The people who can save the day are your conference commissioners. If they can focus long enough in the Big Ten on something other than football contracts and seeing if they can get the University of Hawaii to play Rutgers in a conference game in football, if they could just stop focusing on expansion, right? And they can start focusing on mandating in their own conference. Conferences themselves can take control of this narrative. They're the ones right now, because we've talked about it. The greats have talked about it. Mike Krzyzewski, you've mentioned on this, has talked about it. Bill Belichick has talked about it. All these great minds in the sports world have talked about the need for an NCAA commissioner. You don't have it right now. What you do have are conference commissioners. Those gentlemen, those ladies, they can take control right now and say, in the Big Ten, you have to have X amount of 18-year-olds playing college hockey. In the Big Ten, you can't play in the Big Ten after you turn 23. They can do it as long as it is widespread in just their conference. That's the way you solve this. I just don't know if it happens. At the NCAA level, they're never going to do it. They're never going to make every 18-year-old be where you start. They're never going to make X amount of 18-year-olds, because then they have to do the same thing to everybody else.
So then organically it has to happen team by team by team by team. And we're going to find out starting March 23rd.
And here's the thing with every expansion, eventually comes contraction. With every contraction, eventually you get expansion, supply and demand, the most basic economic principle, right? If you dumb it down all the way, when there's too much, you get less. And then when there's not enough, you get more. And it happens in cycles, boom and bust cycles. It happens in every industry. And considering how much of an industry college sports is, I'm sure the same thing will happen. Now, the NCAA has provided a way to subsidize against that, right? But the NCAA is now losing its power. I think the best way to describe it maybe is the NCAA is like a diner. They do everything, but they kind of also do nothing. Everything's fine, nothing's bad, but nothing's great. I'm not going to a diner because they've got the best steak in town. I'm going to a diner because they got steak at 3 a.m. or 7 a.m. or 12 p.m. But it doesn't mean they're bad. It just means that they're not going to be able to compete with the custom Brazilian steakhouse down the road, which is what the CHL is. As Dan, as you pointed out, they're only focused on hockey. And right now, they're not only focused on hockey, they're only focused on ruining NCAA's standing as the leader.
They are competing. It is a boxing match between Mike Tyson and me looking the other way. Right? It's like, it's unfair right now. I don't know we're fighting, and I'm about to wear a punch from a heavyweight. And that's what March 23 looks like, right? Like, that's what it looks like right now. You're going to have coaches fighting over the transfer portal while the CHL is taking these prospects and locking them in.
Well, it's not. So we're going to find out starting on the 23rd if these CHL players are going to flip. We're going to find out if NCAA deferred commitments are going to play in the CHL. We're going to watch the CHL drafts. This will be interesting to find out if a whole bunch of Americans are going to be drafted in the first, second, and third round. Because typically you would never draft an American in the first, second, or third round unless you were sure that he was coming. Okay. You just can't lose those draft picks. You've got to cash in on them. If there's a ton of Americans being drafted, man, that's going to be like, it's going to be a wild March, April, May, and June, right through to the NHL draft. And we're going to follow it right here. We're going to have announcements and alerts, and we're going to keep everybody abreast of what's happening because it's going to be crazy.
If I'm the CHL right now, I'm looking at the same model that the MLB has when it comes to drafting high school athletes. If you draft the high school athlete and you are unable to sign them to a contract, you lose that draft pick and forfeit it in the forthcoming draft. Do that with Americans. Put teams in a place where they really have to make sure that they've done their due diligence and they're locking these players in. And you cannot just win this battle, you can start lapping the field if you put the onus on your teams to really step up and say, these first 3 rounds, if we get an American, they've got to come play for us. They got to be on the roster. It A, makes those Americans feel real cozy when they get drafted. B, it puts the league itself in a place where it's bolstering its position of the place to play right now over the NCAA. And C, the NCAA is still not thinking about it.
Dan, I want to think more about what you said, but it's an idea, and I can tell you the CHL will be full of ideas.
Yep.
They will all be vetted. They will all be tested by people outside of the CHL. They will test them with parents, with agents, and they'll bring that plan to market. And that is something that Division I hockey does not have. They do not have that leadership. We'll
It feels
find out.
like
It's gonna be crazy.
it feels like one of the things we've said a lot is we'll see if guys flip. We'll see if it changes. We'll see if the trajectory alters. If I'm playing Dan in match play and I'm down 5 holes through 7, I don't think the trajectory is going to get much better. And that's what it kind of feels like right now. It feels like they're down 5 holes through 7 and you're about to hit a 600-yard par 5 and you have no business hitting the fairway.
So having been down 5 after 7, I totally understand.
I'm more of a Stephen Ames, where you're more of a Tiger Woods, Bob.
Here's why I kind of hold out a little bit of hope for Division I.
Yeah.
There's some big time schools that are holding some cards here. Okay, that have openings on their roster. That if they can make a splash and get a Schaefer or get a Michael Misa or get that Lindstrom, the last CHL player who hasn't signed an ELC from last year's NHL draft, it just makes everybody think, what am I missing out on? It works the other way too. If you start seeing Americans not sign with the development program and go to the CHL, just 2 of them. Every year there's 1 or 2. So I'm talking about 1 or 2 after that. If they go to the CHL, it makes players 3, 4, 5, 6 wonder if they should be doing that as well.
Yep.
And again, it comes back to, how do you control the narrative? If Division I has that bomb where on day 1 they get Misa and Schaefer, what do they do with that? How do they spin that? Who's spinning it for them? Are they just hoping that the team who signs them, let's say it's Michigan and BU, I don't know, North Dakota and Denver, I don't know who it's going to be of the big daddies, but they get it. Are they just leaving it up to that school? Because in the CHL, they're just not leaving it up to that school. They've got a marketing machine. Okay, they've got 4 of them. They've got one called the OHL. They've got one called the Western Hockey League. They've got one called the Q. And then they have one umbrella called the CHL that's going to copy everything that they do. We'll see. I'm not counting. I've got too many friends in Division One hockey that I really have a lot of respect for, and I hope they're playing their cards really close to the vest, and they've got a fighter's chance, and they're Buster Douglas, and they hit Mike Tyson right on the chin.
Yep.
Okay, and I'm hoping that's replicated by 20 guys, and they get 20. Like, imagine if that happens. Imagine for the first time the defense that the CHL is playing. Imagine this. Imagine if they get those players, and now the 16 and 17-year-olds who will now be 17 and 18 next year in the CHL. Now those CHL teams have got to be looking over their shoulder, wondering what agent behind their CHL general manager's back is working a deal with his CHL player to go play at Denver, to go play at Michigan, to go play at Michigan State, to go play at Ohio State. Let's say some other players get in the game and they find their Pagula. I mean, it can flip that quickly. But we'll know real quick, guys. We'll know real quick. And if they don't do it this year, Lucas, to your point, did you say 5 down after 7 in match?
Yep.
Okay. You start thinking about, okay, there's only 11 holes left and I'm 5 down. What happens if you're 5 down with 7 left?
Got to make a move.
Well, I mean, it's tougher, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if they don't do anything if Division One doesn't do anything this spring, then they get to the backside and they're still 5 down and they're running out of holes.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And that is where you have to start taking really, and to continue the metaphor, aggressive lines, big shots. And those are high risk, high reward. If the big swings work, great. But the problem is when you take big swings and they fall flat on their face, it's even worse, right? So the longer you wait, the bigger the successes have to be, which increases the risk of flat out failure, not just, oh, we're a little bit down, or, oh, things aren't going all right, but we're still fine. Now you're taking huge swings and potentially getting like embarrassed. Is it too strong a word to say that if you wait too long, you could get embarrassed by as early as the next year or two?
What happens, I think, Lucas, is you start making commitments to younger kids and bringing them in earlier than what they need to be brought in earlier, because you got to take swings at it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is when you can make some big misses. Because listen, you can take these young kids and in the NCAA, let's not kid ourselves. If you take the best 5 NCAA teams and you take the best 5 CHL teams and you put them in the same league, here's your standings at the end of the year. 5 NCAA teams up top, 5 CHL teams at the bottom. Yep. Because the 5 best NCAA teams have NHL prospects and they're older. Okay? So my point is, you start bringing in a younger kid, and we talked about these deferral kids that are NHL picks, but they're not going to be there till 26, 27. Obviously, these NCAA teams think that they're not ready to play at that older age level, and they'll bust out. There was a kid who played at Michigan, I forget his name this year, played 2 years at the development program. He's back in the CHL. I think he's with Kitchener. He wasn't ready to play at that level. And Lucas, to your point earlier about there's no loyalty anymore. All right, I'll go into the portal. I'll go somewhere else. I'll go to a different league. Okay, I'll do whatever I want. Like, it's wild.
And the biggest question, I think, at the end of it all is this: if the conference commissioners don't get involved, like we talked,
right,
the NCAA doesn't make wide-scaling moves. It comes down to the coaches. And Bob, you're a University of Michigan guy. Sadly, we still let you on the podcast.
I didn't say that.
Yeah, you root for University of Michigan. You're
everybody knows you're a big Michigan guy.
Everybody's talking about it.
Yeah.
You're an AAA. You're an Ann Arbor apologist. I got it. And but we look at this. You look at University of Michigan. Let's say they decide, you know what, we are going to be the hotbed for NHL draft picks. We're going to have guys that play in the NHL, and they go and they get 10 guys that are the best 18-year-olds in the country, and they bring them in, and they win 5 games, and they get beat up by 24-year-olds throughout the Big Ten and throughout the country, and they're playing older teams with more depth, with more size, who have played at that level longer, and they have 5 wins at the end of the day. Is that better for the money-making portion of the NCAA, for the nil money that comes in, for finding the boosters, for selling the tickets, for filling the seats? Or is it better to be older, have 0 NHL draft picks, and win a national championship?
Well, I will say this. I'll bet you half the guys, no, I'll bet you a third of the coaches in Division I hockey don't care if they have an NHL pick.
That's the biggest
And they
problem
don't
we deal with right
like
now.
they would like one. I don't, you know, they want to win enough games so they can get another contract.
Correct.
They're not caring about NHL guys. If you're at Michigan or any of the big schools, you got to do 2 things. You got to win hockey games and championships, and you've got to have big time players because your fans are expecting big time players. That's it for tonight, guys. I got nothing else for you. I can't wait. We're almost turning the clock here. It's February 25th when we're recording. This comes out, I think, on the 27th. I mean, we're 3 weeks away from it all happening. And then we're gonna have some fun. And then we're gonna have some fun. And somebody better have a box of Kleenex. I don't know if I should give it to the CHL or if I should give it to the NCAA.
I'll tell you what, Bob, we are excited to keep talking. You've inspired me with some of your articles that everyone can go find at dankshow.com. I'm working right now on Dan K's State of the Hockey Union, where everything lies in this US of A, in the hockey development framework, in what it all looks like, and what parents and players should be looking at in terms of just how this whole thing is going to shake out over the next few weeks, months, and years here in junior hockey from the bottom to the top. You can follow along and be a part of this. You listen to us poo-poo the NCAA Division I folks all day long, and you're saying, you know what? I'm tired of this. The USA ain't losing again. We just lost to Canada in the 4 Nations once again, one more time. We lost to Canada in a big game with all the marbles on the line after beating them in pool play. And I'm not going to watch us lose again. Stop talking negatively about the NCAA. We'll weigh in. Go to @the_NK show. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, TikTok as well, and weigh into the comments, to the DMs. Let us know your thoughts. Where do you think this whole thing's going? Where do you think it ends up? What are we getting wrong? What are we getting right? More importantly, fire those stats at us that you want us to break down and talk about on the next episode. We've got the great Bob Turo. Put this guy to work. Put him to use. Put him to work. He'll let you know. Lucas, anything for the
something
folks?
to do.
I mean, that's it. You say goodbye to the folks, Lucas. Send them home. What do you got? Anything
Give
else?
Bob Turo something to do. Any amount of work. He
The
is
guy's great. The guy's great.
Guy barely works right now. He's
Guy's lying about ever being
golfing
down 5 in a match ever.
He's got more time to get a haircut than any man on the planet, and he shows up in this Zoom room with an unkept mess on top of his head. It's embarrassing.
I can't say anything. I'm wearing a hat because my hair is so messy.
Good night, guys.
Hey, have a good one.